Geordie Journo's back here at the Newcastle United training ground, where we've spoken both to Eddie Howe and Dan Ashworth. Plenty to talk about, and it's coming up. Just like that, we're in a pub, about 10 minutes from the Newcastle training ground. Won't tell you where, try and guess in the comments. I'm here with Jordan, opposite sides, not quite like some Geordie duos, but yeah, Eddie Howe's press conference this morning almost overshadowed by a good hour speaking to Dan Ashworth, Jordan.
Yeah, it almost feels like the Eddie Howe press conference was almost insignificant in many ways because of what followed after. As you mentioned there, 45 minutes with Dan Ashworth. But before we touch on him, we'll do a quick recap of Eddie Howe, and obviously the main thing at the minute is injuries, and that was again top of the agenda. The big one being probably Sven Botman. Newcastle are probably going to wait a couple of weeks and hope that Botman's knee injury heals. If not, then it sounds like he could have to undergo surgery, which could mean months out. So that's potentially a big blow. We'll have to wait and see on that one. And then the other one as well, the most recent one, Matt Targett, doesn't look good for him, in the words of Eddie Howe. He had a scan today, and then obviously we'll wait and see of the outcome on that. It's a hamstring injury for him. The way he went down didn't look good, so I suspect it might be a long one for him as well. But again, we don't know. So the injury list for Newcastle is mounting. I think I've counted 9 players out tomorrow, which is a big blow. But less about Eddie Howe and more about the big thing that's happened over the last month or so. Obviously the Sandro Tonali news. Now Eddie Howe has faced countless questions on Sandro Tonali, some that he said he can't answer, and I think he even said to a couple of questions, it's probably one for Dan. Well, Dan Ashworth got put in front of us this morning at the club's training ground. Really good from the club actually, because in the past they haven't tend to have done this. Access to sporting directors, not that Newcastle had one, but the club people higher up the club and the boardroom never done interviews. I'm talking about the Mike Ashley era here, but since Newcastle were taken over by the PIF owners, they've been very transparent when they can, and I thought it was a really good move to put Dan Ashworth there today, and he faced lots of questions, Dom. So we'll go into it.
Yeah. I mean, I think, fair play to Dan Ashworth for facing the media. It was slightly more relaxed sort of, it wasn't a press conference, if you like, it was more of a huddle than what Eddie Howe faced. But yeah, Dan Ashworth spoke on the record, bit off the record as well, which we can't get into, but it contextualised is what we're saying really, and what Dan Ashworth said about Sandro Tonali, which I think first of all he spoke, talked us through how it came about, and basically it sounds like the club found out about the Sandro Tonali ban as we did, as the reports emerged from the Italian media that potential offences were being looked into, and then it's since transpired, which is obviously a major blow, and what comes from that, the club's next steps. Dan Ashworth couldn't really say too much. Obviously there's potential for legal proceedings and all sorts of various routes the club can explore, but I thought Dan Ashworth spoke as openly as could be expected, given it's still a little bit raw. It's probably something that got brushed under the carpet a little bit the past couple of weeks, with Newcastle playing so many games, and then Sandro Tonali not involved basically from this time last week was when the ban got sort of ratified by the FA and by FIFA. So yeah, I thought it was an insightful 45 minutes, as you say, Jordan, where Dan Ashworth told us a lot. But yeah, the ban first of all being the big thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you used the words huge shock to the football club, and as you mentioned there, Don, I found it quite astounding that the way Newcastle found out about Sandro Tonali's ban was actually through social media like everyone else. That's when they were first alerted to what was happening in Italy. Obviously Tonali was on international duty at the time, was brought in for questioning during that time, and then quickly returned to Tyneside after that. Obviously he's played 2 games, Crystal Palace, Borussia Dortmund, before that ban came through, but it really was a sensational sort of period for Newcastle. Huge news. It was, I think Dan Ashworth mentioned he's been doing this job for 16 years in terms of a sporting director and working behind the scenes of football clubs, and he has never experienced anything like this. Yeah, I think Dan Ashworth was asked should the player have told Newcastle prior to move about his gambling addiction, and I think really difficult
in it to talk about. If you're an addict, can't speak personally, but like it's something you do tend to keep secret. You do try and hide it, and addicts are sometimes the best at doing that. So it's hard really to say whether Sandro Tonali should have said anything or disclosed anything, and as you expect, Dan Ashworth wouldn't get drawn into answering any type of question surrounding that. But yeah, I thought there was some interesting sort of stuff where Dan Ashworth was asked should AC Milan have known about the situation, and again it's a similar sort of thing where it's impossible to tell, but there hasn't been any contact with AC Milan since this ban has transpired, or the news about Sandro Tonali has transpired, or since they've done the deal really. So yeah, a massive shock. And then in terms of legal action regarding the deal, any compensation, it's difficult to disclose any information like that publicly, and Dan Ashworth wouldn't get drawn into anything like that. But something he did sort of entertain was regarding the players and his wages, potential breach of contract, things like that. What he did stress though is contracts are flexible. Just because there's a breach of contract as such doesn't mean it's an automatic fine or reduction of wages or withdrawal of wages completely. And he did praise how Sandro Tonali has handled himself since this news transpired, Jordan.
Yeah, he did. I think he was sort of keen to stress sort of more about the players' welfare rather than getting to the legal side of things. So yeah, he did praise Sandro Tonali's the way he's handled himself since that ban, and since the the investigations. One question that probably everyone was asking out there, and which was asked in the sit down with Dan Ashworth, is would you have signed Sandro Tonali if you knew about this potential, the legal betting scandal that was approaching, and just 3 months after he joined the club, and he sort of mentioned about structuring deals differently if he had have knew. Didn't necessarily say that they wouldn't have signed the player, but they certainly would have done the deal in a very different way.
I think any club knowing a player's going to be banned for 10 months would probably be slightly stay clear of doing a deal, but hindsight is obviously a wonderful thing. And I think Newcastle saw that deal in the summer, top target in a key area, and couldn't really refuse it. It's just a shame what's transpired since. But there was a bit of an update initially from Eddie Howe actually in his press conference. Sandro Tonali is back in training, and I just asked the question to Dan Ashworth what the limits are on what Sandro Tonali can and can't do. And at the moment he can train, he can play intra-squad friendlies at the training ground. There's no clarity yet on whether he can be involved in friendly matches. Newcastle are hopeful he can be, but we'll wait and see on that, because that would be a big boost for the player, where the club can almost set up friendly games for him to play. He's training, and then he's getting the chance to apply what he's doing in training in 90 minutes. It's obviously not going to be the same intensity, but that will be a big boost to get him used to his new surroundings, a new club. He's still only been on Tyneside less than 4 months, so it's one of those where it could almost, a difficult situation could turn into a bit of a positive one for Sandro Tonali when he gets back in towards the back end of August next year.
The training side of things is huge. It's massive that he can train for with his teammates, his new teammates, because you look at the Ivan Toney situation, and you've seen how hard the FA came down on him in terms of his lengthy ban and not being able to train for, I think it was 6 months of the ban as well. So I think when you compare the two, Sandro Tonali's situation is he's probably been let off a little bit lighter, if you can call it that. Still a really lengthy ban, but to not have football completely taken away from the fact that he can't train behind the scenes and playing behind training ground friendlies, whatever you want to call them, say clarity as to whether he could appear, say if Newcastle go to Saudi Arabia next year again, can he play there? We'll have to wait and see. But I think you mentioned there, Dom, it is potentially turning a negative into a positive, because I think, we said before the Barn situation came about, I thought he was a player that looked to be struggling to surround his new surroundings, which is understandable. Joining moving from Italy to the Premier League, not knowing the language, just getting used to the style. And I think we're seeing a player that needed a lot of time. So now the fact that he's been taken out the firing line, if you like, training behind the scenes, getting used to Eddie Howe's methods, and just being able to be around his teammates and have the support of the football club as well. I think one thing that Dan Ashworth really stressed during our 45-minute conversation is that he will absolutely have the full support of everyone behind the scenes. They've just employed a new head of psychology to come in, and Sandro will benefit from that. Player pastoral care as well. There's lots of things behind the scenes now to make sure that Sandro Tonali, in the difficult situation that he is, emerges from it a better person and perhaps even a better player.
Another thing I probably took from it as well, towards the end of the sort of sit down with Dan Ashworth, was about the FA, and obviously Sandro Tonali's betting offences are in relation to his time in Italy, but there's a sort of 3-4 month area where he could have potentially placed more bans while after signing for Newcastle. We don't know that, can't say anything like that for certain. He hasn't been charged for anything like that, but the FA are aware of the situation. Dan Ashworth said they've ratified the ban, but he was asked, could the FA potentially investigate that in the hand Tonali a further ban, which would be a major blow. But fortunately, I say, Dan Ashworth didn't really shed too much light on that and wouldn't really get drawn into that sort of conjecture, if you like.
Yeah, I think the only thing he said was that the FA were fully aware of the investigation from obviously Italian authorities. As you mentioned there, the FA did ultimately ratify the ban. So I think it went through 3 stages, doesn't it, where the Italian authorities put the ban out for 10 months. FIFA then ratified it worldwide, and then the FA, I think, in many ways sort of accepted it and imposed it, obviously ahead of that Wolves game last week. But yeah, I mean, I'm speaking generally. I'm not quoting Dan Ashworth or speaking on what Dan Ashworth said, but I think, if Tonali is admitted to be a gambling addict, did his betting stop when he came to the Premier League? You would probably, I don't know, but you'd probably think probably not, because, as I say, he's a gambling addict. If he's betting all the time, then why would it stop when he got a big move to the Premier League? So again, that falls under FA jurisdiction, where did then the FA have a case to investigate Tonali because of his betting under, say, English jurisdiction? We don't know. But yeah, at the moment, there's no update on that. He's got 10 months ban from the Italian authorities, and hopefully that'll be it, and he can return in August, which is currently the scheduled return date. But I think is that moving ahead? Shall we look to last week January?
I think the big one, moving on, was you've signed your top target for half your transfer budget in the summer. Where do you go from here now? He can't play. His first season's effectively been ended prematurely. So what next for January? Dan Ashworth said, yep, the club are looking whether they sign someone, a like-for-like sort of replacement for Sandro Tonali. They're not sure. They're assessing the options. He said they always plan 2 windows in advance, I think he said, which so they will have already had plans in place for January, and how this ban affects things, whether they go all out and try and sign another midfielder in January, whether they look at loan deals, I'm not sure. He also interestingly mentioned the likes of Louis Miley, Elliot Anderson, players from the academy who can step up. Obviously that's his remit as well, something he wants to see. But yeah, in terms of the transfers, Jordan, he did give quite an interesting sort of update, given the links to Newcastle this January.
Yeah, I mean the obvious one, and the links to the Saudi Pro League. Now obviously 4 teams in the Saudi Pro League are technically, I think, 75% owned by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. Of course, Newcastle's majority owners. So there has been links to signing a midfielder from there, Ruben Neves, the main one. Look, we're not going to sit here and say that we're aware of Newcastle's interest in Ruben Neves. I think it's more paper talk than anything else at the moment. But in theory, he was asked, is there anything stopping you from going to Saudi Arabia in January and loaning the player? And he said, no, not currently. But I think with all the scrutiny that would probably surround that, I think Ashworth sort of hinted at the fact probably in the future that there will be regulations in place with, you know, third-party transactions, etc., where Newcastle might not be able to do that. But as it stands now, that there's nothing stopping them from going to Saudi Arabia in January and signing a loan player, because it's because of Newcastle's owners, scrutiny will be high if Newcastle were to do that. But I don't think they'll be the only club looking to do that. There is a lot of good players going to Saudi Arabia now, and obviously they have a break in the season, and there's good players available. So I don't think Newcastle will be the only team looking to do that. But as I say, because of the owners and who Newcastle are owned by, it would get a lot of scrutiny, and I almost feel like regulations coming to the Premier League to stop clubs from doing that would almost just be for Newcastle, because you can't impose an individual ban on a club saying Newcastle United, you cannot sign players from Saudi Arabia, but then let 19 other Premier League teams do it as well. So I think if they were to implement a wider Premier League regulation, if you like, then it would pretty much be to stop Newcastle. But as I say, you can't impose one ban on one club. So yeah, it's I'll have to wait and see on.
Yeah, it's more the timing of these bans. I mean, as we sit here now, Dan Ashworth did say currently they're fine, they could do anything they wanted in terms of deals with Saudi Pro League clubs. It was just the way he was talking. He was careful in what he was saying and sort of suggesting. Yeah, he said there's a potential different organisations could implement rules that would restrict them in the future. And yeah, like we saw with the sponsorship situation shortly after the Newcastle takeover, it was a general ban for all Premier League clubs. It was just timed, so it really only impacted Newcastle. Yeah. And when you look at the ownership model of Newcastle, I get it, because you look at these 4 Saudi Pro League clubs, the strength of some of their players, I don't think there's any other ownership model in world football that have such a pool of quality. Yeah. Like Manchester City have clubs all over the world, but they're all a significantly lower quality to Manchester City. They couldn't directly sign someone who would improve their side, whereas Newcastle, you could look at Al Hilal, you've got Ruben Neves, you've got Neymar. I'm not saying Newcastle are going to go sign these players. Mitrovic, players who could come in and do a job in the Premier League and arguably improve Newcastle's team. So would this ban really impact Newcastle? I wouldn't say majorly, but it's going to impact them more than any other team, isn't it? If it does come in. So yeah, after sitting down with Dan Ashworth today, getting a bit more light shed on Sandro Tonali's situation, it's probably something the club wanted to get put to bed, if you like. Eddie Howe was getting asked about him fairly consistently, even though could only really say so much. But John, how are you feeling about the situation now? You've spoke to Dan Ashworth at length and got a little bit more clarity and a little bit more understanding of what's going on and how the club are moving forward with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's still obviously a big blow to have, your marquee summer signing to be without him 4 months into a season. It's really difficult to accept, but I think the way the club have handled it, I think I've probably got to give them praise for the way they've handled it. Eddie Howe has answered the questions he could. I mean, the first press conference back after the international break, I thought Eddie Howe was really good. Obviously spoke about the players' welfare, answered what he could, and I think to get the next view, or the proper view, the view from high up in the football club, that was only going to come from a few people, and Dan Ashworth was one of them. So full credit to the football club for putting him up for interview. It was in a lighting 45 minutes. I think Ashworth addressed the media. He's done it a few times for his Newcastle career. I think last time I spoke to him was last year at St James's Park. So to get his perspective was really, really good. I'm just laughing here because there's some music playing. I hope you can still hear us anyway, but
copyright, we'll get a ban.
But I'd say I praise the football club for the way they've handled it. Dan Ashworth again, he's been in really high places in the game. England being the main one, obviously Brighton, etc. as well, and to have his viewpoint and to sit in his presence for 45 minutes and just hear about the dealings, what's going on behind the scenes at the football club, because a lot of it was about Tonali as well, but there was also bits about other things which you'll read on the Newcastle and Shields Gazette in the coming days. But yeah, to sort of conclude the Tonali situation, it is what it is. He's banned now. They'll be without him until August next year. They've got to find a way without him, and yeah, we'll have to wait and see what happens in January. I get the impression they'll do some business. It might not necessarily be a midfielder, but see if the right player comes along. Ashworth said himself he'll do the business. So I do feel like the club, although it's a very difficult situation to be in without the marquee signing, are in very safe hands.
Yeah, and in the meantime, we'll be back at St James's Park on Saturday as Newcastle United take on Arsenal in the Premier League. Nice to be back in Premier League action. Good week, obviously, for Newcastle. We'll be joined, as always, by our fellow Geordie journo, Liam Kennedy. He's currently enjoying his half-term. So we'll see him tomorrow and catch up with him and hopefully reflecting on another positive result for Newcastle United. So in the meantime, please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that, support the Geordie journos, and we'll see you tomorrow.